Good morning, Chicago. Good morning, Illinois. Hello, educators from other states and other countries. This is Rasha Alhaj. I will be your moderator along with Deborah Lynch for today's webinar entitled Cooling Down for the Summer, Stress Management Tips for Teachers, presented by Dr. Rain Bozeman from the Department of Psychology at Chicago State University. Today is our last webinar. Thanks for all those who stuck with us for 9 weeks. We hope it was worth your time. But before we start, I'd like to go over some housekeeping. It is recommended that you view the webinar in full mode and have all other tabs or web pages closed for better viewing quality. If you encounter any technical problems, please try to troubleshoot your device on your internet connection independently. The majority of times, the technical troubles you might encounter can be solved on your end, and we really have no way of attending to those issues, especially with such a large group. I would like to draw your attention to an important feature. If you look to your right on the control panel, you will see the question tab. Please write down your questions in the space provided. Dr. Lynch and I will be reviewing those questions and sharing them with Dr. Bozeman for the Q&A at the end of the presentation. Make sure your questions are sent to everyone and not private so we can see them and share them. We will be launching 3 poll questions. If you set your screen to full mode, it will allow you to answer. And if for some reason you cannot participate in the polls, that's okay. You can still type in your answer in the questions box. The session will be recorded and shared. You will receive an email from us with your certificate of completion, the PowerPoint presentation, and the link to the recorded webinar. And then finally, at the end of the webinar, we ask you to complete an exit survey sharing your evaluation of the webinar. And before I introduce our presenter, we just would like to see who is with us today. So I am launching a poll asking who's with us today. Are you early childhood education, elementary, secondary, special education, or other? So we'll give it a few seconds so we can have your votes, and then we'll share the results. Okay, we're at 70%. That's good. A few more seconds. %76. All right, looks like we have a lot of elementary education with us today. Welcome, welcome. All right, so here we are. We have a lot of elementary education teachers, many special education teachers, many other, and very few early childhood. So welcome everyone. Let me hide this. And let me introduce to you our presenter. Dr. Rain Bozeman uses she, her pronouns. She is an assistant professor of psychology at Chicago State University, where she also serves as the faculty advisor for the Black Student Psychological Association. She is originally from South Africa and completed her BA in psychology at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Before attending graduate school at Loyola University, Chicago, Rain took a gap year and spent some time leading after-school programs through the AmeriCorps National Service Program. She comes from a family of educators and has a passion for cooking, ballroom dancing, and racial justice. As a social psychologist, Rain conducts experimental research on prejudice and intergroup relations. Her biggest hope for her role at Chicago State is to inspire the next generation of undergraduate psychology majors to consider a career in research because representation matters. Without further ado, I give the virtual floor to Dr. Bozeman.
Thank you, Rasha, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I hope to leave you today with some tips about stress management so that you can get your summer kicked off to a good start. But before we get into that, I want you to consider this question. It says, your body is present, but is your mind? Think about that for just a second. I want you to do a self-check with yourself right now. Do me a favor and just pinch yourself on the arm. I know it might sound strange, but just go ahead and give yourself a nice little pinch just to confirm that your body is physically present. The question is, though, where is your mind? You all are logged in right now to this webinar, but it's very possible that there are other distractors around you. We call these webinars because they're online seminars, and if we were in person, I might have the ability to engage you and wow you and keep your attention the entire time. But how will you choose to engage and keep your own attention throughout the course of this presentation? So I encourage you to stay in the present as we continue to speak. When we focus too much on the past, we can end up creating pain for ourselves. We often think too much about things that we could have or should have, coulda, shoulda, woulda done. And those coulda, shoulda, wouldas create feelings of guilt, depression, and shame. So thinking too much about that can really be bad for us. Conversely, when we think too much about the future, this can create a lot of worry and fear about the unknowns. So I'm going to encourage you to stay in the present, because the present indeed is a gift, and I'm hoping that we can learn to enjoy it throughout the course of this presentation. So before I go any further, I think it's important for us to ground ourselves. I'd like us to take a moment to just breathe, especially in the context of all that we're experiencing in the United States right now with racial injustice and the pandemic that we're dealing with. This is a huge source of stress for a lot of people. And this concept of breath has become a really prevalent concept in the news lately, if you all have been paying attention. And breathing is such a critical tool that we can use to help relax us. So I want us to all engage in a very short mindfulness meditation. It's just a breathing exercise. And what I'm going to ask you to do is, hopefully you're in a place right now that's free from distractions. If at all possible, turn off your cell phone, maybe close the door, find a quiet place to sit so that you can do this breathing exercise. The next thing I'm going to ask you to do is just ensure that you're sitting up nice and straight in your chair. Maintain good posture. That means keep your shoulders back, lift your chin up, and keep your feet flat on the floor. Now, to start this breathing exercise, I'm going to ask you to just close your eyes and then just slowly begin to steady your breathing. So breathe in through the nose and out through the mouth, and do that steadily and slowly for a few minutes. And as you're breathing slowly, I want you to pick up on the sensations around you. Notice what it feels like, your body, the weight of your body in the chair. Notice what it feels like, the temperature of the air around you. Now direct your thoughts to anything that your mind is focused on. If your thoughts are gently wandering, or if you're feeling a little uncomfortable with this exercise, that's okay. The point here is just to allow yourself to be fully present in this moment and just breathe. Thank you for doing that with me. Let's get into some definitions. What exactly is stress? We hear this word thrown around quite a bit, and I think stress gets a pretty bad rap. Stress, in fact, is a normal reaction to the demands of our everyday lives, according to the American Psychological Association. Now, this word normal might sound a little strange to you. So why would we consider stress a normal reaction? How can this possibly be a positive thing? I'm curious to know what you all think about this idea that stress is normal. I don't have the ability to see your chat responses, but I'd like you to please type into the chat box how you've heard stress referred to. Have you ever heard stress referred to as something normal, or have you always heard it referred to as something negative or undesirable? If you could go ahead and type those chat responses now. When we talk about stress being normal, what we mean is that stress readies our body to take action. Stress prepares us to either fight threats from our environment, to take flight or run away from those threats, or to freeze and prepare ourselves for our next course of action. In other words, stress is our body's way of preparing to respond. Our brains are hardwired to respond to threats from our physical environment. Now, this was very adaptive for our early human ancestors who had to find themselves running away from tigers and wild animals in the jungle. The thing is, our brains haven't forgotten this response. And so our brains sometimes overreact to situations that are not tigers. We treat changing dirty diapers the same way that we respond to a threat like a tiger in the environment. So the point here is that when stress becomes chronic or unmanaged, that's when it becomes a problem. Now, part of stress being normal means that everyone is susceptible to it. So stress affects us all, and it affects us in different ways depending on how we interpret the challenge that we face. It also affects us differently depending on how we interpret our resources. In other words, if you find cooking a really difficult challenge, but you know that you have a recipe and all the ingredients and a nice oven, then maybe you can interpret that really difficult challenge as something pretty mundane. So it really depends on how you view your resources. Now, there are multiple sources of stress, and I want you to take a minute and consider what sources of stress are bothering you the most right now. For many people, finances are a major source of stress. A lot of people have found themselves either furloughed because of the pandemic or completely out of work, which puts a strain on people's finances. And we know that financial strain is the source of a lot of distress for families. Again, because we're dealing with a pandemic, a lot of people are experiencing illness or injury. When we experience a physical source of distress, like a broken bone, that can be just as stressing to our minds as some of these emotional sources of stress. Divorce or separation can cause a lot of pain and harm to people. And one that we're all dealing with now as teachers is new work demands. The shift to online teaching has put a lot of pressure on educators across the nation. So work demands are one source of stress. Another could be stigmatization. We're seeing this a lot here lately in the news where people are experiencing trauma from racial violence. People who are members of stigmatized groups experience stress that exceeds ordinary everyday life stress. And these are just a handful of examples. I'm sure you all can come up with a couple more. Maybe take a minute to type in the chat box, what are some sources of stress that are really prevalent or really bothering you at this moment? As you start to think about your sources of stress, I want you to consider where those sources of stress are playing out in your life. Stress causes a lot of problems for us with our physical health. It impacts our cardiovascular system, it can weaken our immune system, and it can disrupt our cognitive functioning. So this is a little engagement exercise that I'd like you to take a minute to do. If you have a pen and paper handy, go ahead and jot down the page 1 through 10 And what I'm going to ask you to do is do this quick self-assessment. So for each item 1 through 10, I'd like you to give yourself a rating on a scale from 1 to 5. And when you think about this, I want you to focus solely on how you felt over the last 6 months. So keep the time period relatively small. Don't spend too much time thinking about this because I want you to go with your gut reaction. In other words, if you've had a lot of headaches, item 1, then you might give yourself a rating of 4. You often have headaches, or 5. You always have headaches. If you take item 8, for example, fatigue, if you've rarely felt tired over the last 6 months, then give yourself a 2. Or if you've never felt that tired over the last 6 months, give yourself a 1. So please take 2 to 3 minutes now to rank each of these 10 items. And what I'm going to ask you to do is actually add up your scores. Because in a minute, we're going to take a poll just to gauge the level of stress that we are all experiencing during this crazy time. So please take just a minute to give yourself a ranking for each item and then add up your total score for all of 10 items. I'm going to give about just 1 more minute for folks to give themselves rankings and to compute their score. What you'll end
Dr.
up with is this.
Bozeman, I'm
Yes.
sorry. The number 10 and number 5, they're both trouble sleeping. Do you, can we suggest to change trouble sleeping number 10 to other?
Yes.
Okay, because I'm seeing a lot of people noticing this.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Okay, now that folks have had a few minutes to give themselves a ranking for each of those items, including the new item 10, which is other, you can go ahead and just fill in whatever item that you want for that one. Maybe you know a stress symptom that has been really prevalent for you here lately. You should end up with a score somewhere between 10 and 50. And what we'd like you to do now is complete the poll to just tell us, where do you fall in terms of your scores? Are you in the category of 10 to 20 points? Are you in the category of 21 to 30 points? Maybe you're in the category 31 to 40. Or perhaps like me, you're feeling a lot of symptoms of stress and you're in the category 41 through 50.
We are at 62% responses. We'll give it a few more seconds. 66%. All right, here we go. Dr. Bozeman, can you see the results? I just posted them.
I
can
not
read them for you.
Yes,
So
if
we
you
have 10 to 20 is 21%, 21 to 30, that's 48%, so that's the majority. 31 to 40, we have 28%, and 41 to 50, that's 4%.
folks, that's actually quite a positive sign. If you consider all that we've been experiencing over the last 6 months, all the uncertainty of pandemic, all of the upheaval in our country with what's going on politically, all the changes that you all have had to make, all the adjustments on the fly, you all seem to be able quite well to handle some of your stress, or perhaps the items that I mentioned are just not how your stress is showing up. So I'm curious to know how your stress is showing up. So keep thinking about that, because I think this self-reflection is a very important part of stress management. So now I want to get into what can we do now that we've started with self-reflection, and I think that's a very important first step. Before we can begin to manage our stress, we have to be able to identify where that stress is coming from. So what is the source? And what is that stress doing to our body? Is it disrupting our sleep? Are we having lots of headaches? Are we experiencing mood shifts? And I think starting with self-reflection helps us, because if we know what the source is, we might be able to address that source head on. Sometimes, however, there's nothing we can do about the source of stress. None of us asked for this pandemic, and yet we still have to manage our stress level around that. So identifying the source is an important first step, because it helps us know where to direct our energy. The next thing I would encourage you to do so that we can manage our stress is just take care of your body. Boost your body's wellness. And you can do that in 3 ways, and I'm sure there are many others, but here are 3 important things that you can do. The first is just to nourish yourself. Eat healthy and stay hydrated will help you with both your physical health and your mental health. The next thing is to do a little bit of exercise. I know this is particularly hard for me right now in this pandemic, because I don't have the luxury of going out to a gym. But I'm making some accommodations by doing things I can around the house. Stretching, for example, taking a jog when I can, maybe doing a few push-ups. Just that little bit of exercise each day really gets the body going and pumps up all kinds of positive hormones that help us feel better and reduce feelings of pain, and actually amplify feelings of euphoria. And the last thing I'll say is to get some quality sleep. And this gets a little harder for some of us in the summertime, because maybe we don't have air conditioning. So finding a nice, cool, and quiet place to sleep at a consistent time every night, and staying away from our cell phones, is one way to boost our body's wellness and get quality sleep. The next tip that I will suggest is to take care of your mental health. Be kind to your mind. And there's a variety of things that I would suggest in terms of mental health. The first is what we started with at the beginning of this presentation, and that is just stay in the present. We know that if we lurch to the future, we can start worrying, and if we jump to the past, we can start ruminating and creating pain. So if you just try to stay mentally present in the moment, that will help you. And do this gently. If you find yourself ruminating or drifting, there's ways to stop yourself and redirect. You can do it in part by practicing meditation, like that breathing exercise that we did in the beginning. Once you get comfortable doing that exercise a few times, I encourage you to challenge yourself a little bit by trying to increase your focus. So instead of just allowing your thoughts to wander, increase the challenge by trying to focus on clear your mind completely. So once you get comfortable with the meditation, you can up the ante. As I mentioned before, interrupting negative thoughts is important. So if you find yourself thinking too much about the past, it's okay to give yourself a distractor. Almost like a dog when they see a squirrel. They quickly shift, like, oh, squirrel. If you find yourself thinking too much about negative thoughts of the past, give yourself a squirrel moment by interrupting those negative thoughts. You can also change your mindset by amplifying things that are positive. I'm sure there's many things in your life that you are grateful for. If you allow yourself to shift your thoughts to those things, it actually can change your mindset. This is not just some pop psychology. These are actually research validated advice. And the last point here, I think, is to control what you can, because worrying about things that are out of our control is a really bad mental cycle. But choosing not to control the things that we do have control over actually is not adaptive either. So it does take a little bit of insight to know what it is that you can and cannot control. And furthermore, it takes a little bit of bravery to try to control those things. But I encourage you to go ahead and control those things that you can. And finally, I recently discovered a really interesting TED Talk that says, stress actually can be our friend, but only if we rethink our view of stress. As I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, many of us have a very negative view of stress, that it's always bad and always harmful. But in fact, if you recall and consciously choose to recall that stress is just our brain's way of gearing up our body for action, then we can view stress as more of a friend and a helper rather than something truly negative. The fourth piece of advice is to use your social connections. We as humans are social creatures. That means that we thrive off healthy and meaningful connections with other people. When we start to feel low, we can refuel ourselves by our connection with other people. We can replenish our mental and emotional fuel tank with sprinkles of love from those around us. So I encourage you that even though we might be experiencing physical distance from other people, we don't necessarily need to socially distance. We need to be socially connected, I would say. And finally, we're about to enter the summer. That means that you as teachers get to take a time out. I encourage you to do this. Really enjoy your summer. Make some time for hobbies and leisure. We might not be able to travel, so vacation might not be possible for us, but you could staycation. You might go out to the dollar store and buy yourself some bath bubbles and some candles and create a nice home spa experience for yourself. Or take a nice walk in nature. The parks are now opening back up in the city of Chicago, so we're able to go outside and just enjoy this beautiful sunshine that we have. Take a minute to just savor those positive experiences. Maybe you could read a good book. This is a perfect time to get into some leisure reading. Or create yourself your happy playlist. I don't know what those songs are for you, but I've got a few that just get me going. You can create spaces for yourself where it's possible to find enjoyment in the midst of really uncomfortable and distressing situations. So I'm curious about which of these strategies resonated with you all. If you think of those 5 tips that we just went through, are there any that you think you're likely to use? Can you go ahead and respond to the poll now, please?
The poll is up, and we have 53%, 56%, 60%. And I think we have a winner. Enhanced body wellness. Okay, we're at 70%. Uh-huh. Okay, a few more seconds. And I will close the poll. All right, so here we go. Self-assessment, we had 27%. Enhanced body wellness, our winner, 54%. And be kind to your mind, 42%. That was like a big hit too. Seek social support, 26%. and time out, 36%. So the top three were enhanced body wellness, be kind to your mind, and time out.
Folks, that's great news. I'm glad that you all are going to take some of these stress management tips. And I just want to encourage you that this is all possible even in the midst of all that we're experiencing. As a disclosure, I want to say that I got a lot of this information both from the Chicago State University Employee Health Program and also from my own chiropractor's office. That's one physical thing that I can do to manage my bodily stress is I go and see a chiropractor on a regular basis. I happen to be fortunate enough that that's something that my family can afford to do. And some of these tips and strategies came directly from the chiropractor's office, things like taking care of your body, which flows directly into taking care of your mind. But all of these are interlocking bits of advice that contribute to our holistic wellness. And so I encourage you, even if you might be unlikely to start with self-reflection, maybe challenge yourself that if that wasn't a strategy that you chose, maybe challenge yourself to choose that strategy in the future. So I wanted to just give you 5 nice condensed chunks that you could take away with you to help you manage stress as you approach these summer months. And I welcome any feedback or comments that you all have. If you'd like to continue this conversation offline, here's my contact information. You can reach me via email, rbozeman@csu.edu. I also want to give some credit to the website thenounproject.com, which is where I found a lot of the graphics for this presentation. Thank you all very much for your attentiveness, and I welcome any questions now.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Bozeman, for a really terrific set of ideas and suggestions. So we are going to open it up to Q&A with Dr. Bozeman. So please start identifying in the question box any questions that you have for her. I did notice, just as people are formulating some questions, your 2 previous questions were quite interesting, how people looked at stress, and a recurring theme was that it was negative. And then we had a number of people, you had asked a question also about the kinds of things in addition to the 10 items in the self-assessment that were stressful. So so we can maybe go back over some of those as well. So does anybody have any questions for Dr. Bozeman? One quickie, what was the name of the resource, the site that you used, Dr. Bozeman? Would you mind repeating?
The Noun, N-O-U-N project, P-R-O-J-E-C-T, or C-T, thenounproject.com.
Okay, all right. One of our participants talked about how doing volunteer work has helped her stress. She takes meals to elderly people. Volunteering might be a good stress reliever, right?
I fully agree. I think that ties into the idea that shifting our focus from our own problems to the bigger picture can really help us put things into perspective. So when we realize that others have more needs than we do, and we can muster resources to be generous in that moment, that generosity makes us feel good, for number one, but it also helps us keep things in perspective so that we don't over catastrophize what we're experiencing.
Yeah. Another question, how do we help children handle stress?
You know, that's a tricky one, and I think it depends on the age of the child. I have a 12-year-old, and so I like to just have open conversation with her at her age level about whatever she has questions about. I try to be very honest with her about my own emotions, so I'm vulnerable when I'm experiencing pain or grief or distress or even frustration. I want to demonstrate to her that it's okay to be frustrated, but then to maybe adapt and handle those things well later. So I would encourage parents not to conceal things from their children as much as they can help demonstrate to your children how to handle things well. And if you're practicing these things yourself, they'll pick up on them.
All right, here's a good one. You said that we need to meditate. Does screaming "Sweet Baby Jesus" count?
As long as you do it very calmly with good breathing, then you baby Jesus. I certainly think there is space for venting, but the point here is not to let that be the primary way that we release our frustration, because research tells us that getting out our frustration and aggression through catharsis actually is not that effective of a strategy. So I encourage some more of these mindfulness techniques rather than purely cathartic techniques.
Another question, can you give some suggestions for sleeping better?
Sleeping better, yeah, for sure. So it's super hard, I think, nowadays for us to think of ourselves as unplugged because everything has gone so digital. But what we know is that light affects us in our sleeping patterns. So if we can start getting into a good rhythm, that can coach our body into getting good sleep. So I would say start by maybe getting off your cell phone about an hour before you want to go to bed. Also start dimming the lights around you. Maybe don't watch that high energizing movie right before you want to sleep. So get your physical environment prepared for you to lull you. So get as many things around you to foster sleep so that you don't have to do as much of the mental work to make yourself fall asleep. So that includes light, and that includes temperature, and that includes sound.
Are there any apps that you could recommend that help with stress?
I personally have not tried them, but I know that many of them exist. I've heard of Calm, C-A-L-M, and I'm not sure if that's a paid app or not. I believe that's a meditation app. There's also some that are really nice if you want to do some of this leisure stuff that you could color on certain apps. I like to do the coloring apps just for some like mindless entertainment. That's very calming to me. I like to personally actually color in coloring books too as a leisure activity. So in terms of apps, I know of the Calm app and certain coloring book apps, and I'm sure that you can search those in your app store and find plenty of free options.
Another question, how to deal with unrealistic expectations from administrators or bosses?
Well, that is a political challenge as much as it's an interpersonal challenge. So, you know, if you have the ability, I would say the first thing to do is just to have an open conversation with someone. Perhaps they have unrealistic expectations because they're unfamiliar with what it's like to be in your shoes. And so opening up that conversation and allowing for empathy might be a good first step. But if you see that that's not productive, you might need to call in some allies and some institutional support to get the message across.
Okay, one of our participants wondered if you if you do individual therapy.
Well, I'm actually not a clinician, so I'm glad you asked. I'm trained as a social psychologist, which means that I know a lot about how human behavior happens in social settings. I know very little about clinical psychology other than it's an important branch of our field and what we train Chicago State students to do in our graduate program.
Okay, another question, an important one. What to do when the stress does not let you focus on anything, even to the point of forgetting basic personal information?
You know, part of what I think helps me is to have some organizing tools. So I don't try to put all the pressure on my brain. I try to outsource some of that work to some of our tools. So I keep a good calendar, and I'm very detailed about what goes into that calendar. And I'll make notes to myself, and I'll set alarms on my phone. If you have a spouse or anyone that you need to coordinate with in terms of family management, it helps to share that calendar with your spouse. I do the same thing so that I don't have to spend as much time juggling what do I have to do now? Where do I have to go? I can just rely on these systems. So sometimes it helps to just have structures and systems in place that take the mental pressure off of you.
Good ideas. Another one, how do we handle the stress of the uncertainty as we try to figure out if school is going to start next year?
You know, that's a great question. I'm an educator myself, and there's a lot of uncertainty even for higher education about what the future will hold. And I would just say this is a piece of advice that comes directly from the movie Frozen. So if you've seen the children's movie Frozen, you'll identify this advice. And that is, I would say, do the next right thing. What universities or schools or institutions will do in the future is entirely out of our control as employees. But many of us got into these fields for benevolent reasons. We care about our students. We want to do well and contribute to society. So I encourage you to just focus on those things that you are able to control and just do the next right thing until you know more about what the future will hold. I think embracing the uncertainty in this moment is the best thing that we can do for ourselves instead of resisting it, because this wave of uncertainty is just the waters that we're swimming in right now.
Another question, can you please go into a little more detail about self-assessment?
Okay, sure. Self-assessment really just means an opportunity for self-reflection. So what I'm suggesting with self-assessment is to check in with yourself. So all of those probing questions that I asked throughout the presentation, how do you feel? What is your source of stress? What's stressing you out the most right now? What has stressed you out in the last 6 months? Those are the kinds of questions I'm encouraging you to ask yourself, because we might find ourselves frantic and not really know why and think that it's an abnormal thing. But if we really sit down and weigh all of what we're experiencing and we're able to put those things into perspective, it gives us some context that helps us normalize things and not feel so bad about ourselves. Because it's already stressful enough, the things that we experience. We don't have to make it harder on ourselves by just amplifying that negativity.
How should caregivers deal with stress in the elderly if they live with seniors?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I would say compassion. Compassion is probably a good place to start. Someone mentioned, generosity and doing good for society as something that they do. And I think having that empathy and compassion can help us understand maybe where the other person is coming from, maybe anticipate what it might be like to be in their shoes and realize that they are probably more stressed and more vulnerable than you are as the caregiver. So just recognizing that you have more resources, although you might be feeling overwhelmed, recognizing that you actually do have some resources at your disposal to help manage your stress.
And another question, how do you handle people who are close to you that stress you out?
It depends on the person. It truly depends on the person. I read a really nice book. It's called Who is Pushing Your Buttons? It's a great book because it helps you deal with problematic people in your life. It gives lots of strategies of how to deal with those people, but it also encourages self-reflection, because what this book tells us is that perhaps some of the ways that people are responding to us that we perceive as negative are merely a reactionary tactic because of how we are treating them. And so that's why this is an important thing to balance self-reflection with all of these other stress management tactics. So I would say, before you start looking to someone else and why they're making you mad, consider, why are you getting so mad?
Sounds good. One book I just put on my summer reading list was by Albert Ellis. I think he's one of the founders of cognitive behavior therapy, and it's How to Stubbornly Refuse to Make Yourself Miserable. I can't wait to read it.
That does sound like a good one.
All righty, next question. What is the difference between anxiety and stress?
Anxiety is prolonged worry. So anxiety is fear that has taken on a nebulous target. So if you think about fear, and I'll use the tiger example again. If there's a tiger ready to eat you, you're going to feel a lot of fear in that moment, and that's a warranted emotion. Now, if there's no tiger and you feel that same amount of fear all the time, that's what we can identify as anxiety, a prolonged fear that doesn't have a specific source or target. It's just worry, essentially. Stress, as we talked about in this presentation, is more of a physiological response to any demand from our environment. And it doesn't have to necessarily be a negative thing. It becomes negative, stress does, when it becomes chronic and unmanaged.
Okay, another question. What are some ways to get into a daily exercise routine? And I know we had a lot of people identifying enhancing their body practices. So any suggestions for ways to get into that daily exercise routine that can be so important?
Well, I would say hold yourself accountable firstly. So that means setting up a specific time that you plan to do it, have an actual plan of what you want to do. Maybe you want to do 5 push-ups and 10 sit-ups. And the first thing I would say is to start small. You don't want to set goals for yourself that you're unable to accomplish, because that will leave you feeling more helpless and more stressed or depressed about it. So I would encourage you to start by setting small goals and then holding yourself accountable to just reaching those goals. So maybe day 1 is just, today I stretch. Today I just do a couple of stretches, and that's my workout for the day. And tomorrow I'll add something new. And the day after that, I'll add 2 more of those things. So I would encourage you to start incrementally and just stick with those small increments.
Okay, sounds good. One of our participants put a nice idea for addressing the stress or preventing stress for her children. She says she has 2 children, age 6 and 9. We have theme nights once a week, a beach party, fancy dinner party, science night, and so on. This gives them something to look forward to since they are stuck at home and many of their activities have been canceled. So that was a nice suggestion for trying to prevent stress from really affecting young children.
Yeah, I like that idea.
And it also, yeah, puts the focus on somebody else and takes it off of your own stress a little bit too. Next question, how can I stop spiraling the anxiety that causes panic attacks when I can't get out of my own head?
You know, that's a really difficult question, and I would suggest that perhaps it might be appropriate to speak to an expert. These suggestions in terms of stress management are for people who are what we call at an average level of stress, ordinary everyday life stresses. But there may be some folks on the call for whom anxiety or depression is a true mental health diagnosis, and I don't want to speak to any of that in specific detail because that's really between you and a mental health expert. So if you find that your stress becomes, or your anxiety or your depression or any other mental health issue becomes so disruptive that it's causing you to not be able to function in your everyday life, then I strongly encourage you, if you're able and you have the resources, to contact a mental health expert and get some counseling and support for that.
Sounds like good advice. One of our participants did weigh in on the Calm app that was mentioned earlier. She says Calm is a free app. It's free for 7 days, and then it costs about $60 for the year. And she said it's a really great app.
Nice.
Next question, and thank you for that. Next question, what if you have poor social skills and find yourself suffering from loneliness?
You know, social anxiety is a really big problem, and especially when we're physically distant from other people. It's hard when we're online to make those connections in the same way that we do when we're face to face. So when we had the opportunity to just be out physically, you might have run into a friend at the gym, or you might have run into an acquaintance at the grocery store. But now those chance encounters are much less likely. So it will take some deliberate effort to find those affinity spaces. But I do encourage you to maybe start with affinity spaces, meaning find places of connection where you already have something that you share in common with those people. So perhaps it's an online Dungeons and Dragons group. I'm just coming up with random examples. I have a friend, a colleague who's in a knitting group, or maybe you start a book club. So there's something that draws you all together. There's some sense of familiarity, because that does foster connection. We know that birds of a feather tend to flock together. And so if you can find those birds, go ahead and flock with them.
All right, a specific question for remote learning. What are some stress relief suggestions to use while instructing students during remote learning, especially when they are not focused?
You know, I deal with college students, and so my perspective is slightly different in terms of what it takes to stay engaged. One strategy that I've used with remote learning is I try to make our chat conversations super casual and low key. In other words, any instruction that I want to do, I do over a pre-recorded video. And so students have to do that work asynchronously. And whenever we do have synchronous chat sessions, it's really just to have a casual discussion. So it's very low key and low pressure. And if they tune out, like they sometimes do in the classroom, I'm okay with that. So it depends on your goals as a teacher. But I would say maybe short increments, because we know that our attention span is not very long, especially if we're doing things online. It can be very distracting. But I would say maybe encourage your students, or emphasize that you have the same classroom policies that you would in a physical classroom space. So if you have a no cell phone policy, ask your students to go ahead and turn their cell phones off. If you have a no talking in class policy, ask your students to, for whatever that hour is, don't be distracted talking to friends and family who might pop in and want to talk to you while you're doing class time. So just try to normalize that this is still a learning environment, and that the expectations, although we've made some adjustments, your expectations haven't changed.
Thank you. Another participant stated that it's hard to stop worrying about the future. Any tips for calming down once down a rabbit hole?
Yes, so if you recall my squirrel suggestion, it sounds funny, but you can literally distract yourself. I would encourage you to interrupt as soon as you find yourself going down those thoughts. Interrupt yourself and try to focus on something in the present moment. Maybe it's the tree that I'm looking at outside my window right now, or maybe it's looking at these interesting graphics that I have on my computer, or just any random thing that you can shift your attention to. And as many times as you have to do that process, your brain will start training itself that those negative thoughts are not welcome, and that you will become accustomed to rejecting those negative thoughts. So it really is a matter of practice and frequency, rather than arriving at some level of non-rumination.
Okay, great. Just taking a look, some of these other questions here. Is there such a thing as stress from a midlife crisis? If so, how does one deal with that?
Yeah, I think life changes cause distress throughout many phases of life. And how to deal with that, I think in many of these tactics will work for any source of stress. So these tips came before COVID, but they will apply to the stress from the pandemic. These tips can be applied to the stress of a midlife crisis. These tips can be applied to the stress of a divorce or separation. So any of these strategies, or all of them if you choose to use them all, can be helpful. So being kind to yourself and focusing on your social relationships and treating your body well, all of these things will help you regardless of what challenges that you are experiencing.
Okay. One participant asks whether it is normal not to be bothered by staying at home. While others are going crazy, I'm actually more relaxed, she says, because I'd rather be home in general.
I think that word normal is something that's tricky and it's thrown around a lot, but I think what I would say to that is people are all different. And so if you find yourself at peace with what people are going through with staying at home, then that's great. And it's perfectly acceptable for you to be in a different place about what we're all going through than everyone else. So human behavior has a lot of variability, and the fact that you are one of those people is perfectly great.
Okay, well, Dr. Bozeman, any concluding thoughts? We're kind of at the end of our webinar session here today. Any concluding thoughts before we turn the session back over to Dr. El-Haj? And in those concluding thoughts, if you could repeat again the source of your graphics somebody asked for as well.
Yes, so my concluding thoughts are that some of these things might sound funny to you, but if they do, I would say maybe start there. Start with the things that you're uncomfortable with, because that might be the most helpful thing. That might be the thing that you need to do the most. And the graphics that I used came from the Noun, N-O-U-N, project.com, thenounproject.com.
All right, well, I'm going to turn the webinar back over to Dr. El-Haj. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Lynch. Thank you, Dr. Bozeman, for another great presentation. And it was interesting to hear the Q&A questions and answers. We would like to remind you that the session has been recorded and will be shared. You will receive an email from us with your certificate of completion, the PowerPoint presentation, and the link to the recorded webinar. As soon as you exit the webinar, we ask you to complete the exit survey. It will pop up on your screen, so please take a couple minutes to complete it. Your feedback is very important to us. And on a final note, we would like to
thank you for hanging with us for 9 weeks.
We hope you're leaving with some new and helpful techniques.
COVID-19 united us under pressure.
But believe us when we say it really was our pleasure.
This was Deb and Rasha as your webinar moderators.
We wish you all the best as you shine as educators.
Stay safe, de-stress, and be strong.
You deserve the best after what you've undergone.
As you start your summer, don't forget Chicago State.
If you join our team, you will only be great. Thank you, everyone. Stay safe and have a wonderful day. Bye now.
Bye now.